The great hall of the Silver Moon Pack territory had been decorated with white roses and silver ribbons, but to Alara, it looked more like a funeral than a wedding. She stood at the entrance in a dress that didn't fit properly, the fabric hanging loose around her thin frame, a constant reminder of how she had always been different, always been less. The whispers had followed her since childhood, growing louder with each passing year as she failed to shift completely. Her wolf form never fully, manifesting beyond a flicker of golden eyes and the occasional surge of heightened senses that left her exhausted and shaking. The pack had decided long ago what she was worth, and that worth was measured in how useful she could be, how quietly she could disappear into whatever role they assigned her. Today, that role was bride to Beta Marcus Thornfield, and everyone in the hall knew exactly what kind of future awaited her behind his closed doors. Marcus stood at the altar with Alpha Gerald of Silver Moon, both men wearing expressions that made Alara's stomach turn. Gerald had raised her after her parents died when she was 7, but he had never been kind, never been paternal. He had been a warden, and she had been a burden he tolerated, only because pack law required it. Marcus was worse. He was known throughout the territory for his cruelty, for the Omegas who entered his household and emerged broken, if they emerged at all. There had been 3 before, each one eventually, disappearing with explanations that satisfied no one but were never questioned because questioning Marcus meant questioning Gerald, and no one questioned the Alpha. Alara had begged Gerald not to make her do this, had gotten on her knees and pleaded, but he had backhanded her so hard she tasted blood for 3 days and told her she should be grateful anyone wanted to claim a defective Omega like her. The ceremony was attended by representatives from packs across the kingdom, as was customary for any Beta's wedding, but the real draw was the presence of King Kale Stormborn himself. The Alpha King rarely attended such events, preferring to govern from his fortress in the northern mountains, but when he did appear, the very air seemed to grow heavier with his power. Alara had only seen him from a distance before, a tall figure in black whose face remained impassive as stone, while he observed the political theater of pack alliances and treaties. The rumors about him were legendary and terrifying. They said he had killed his own fated mate 5 years ago because she had been too weak to stand beside him as queen, that he had torn out the throat of an alpha who dared question his authority, that he felt nothing, wanted nothing except absolute control over his kingdom. Some whispered he wasn't entirely wolf anymore, that something darker lived inside him, something ancient and merciless that had consumed whatever humanity he once possessed. As Alara walked down the aisle, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand, she felt eyes on her from every direction. Some looked at her with pity, others with contempt, most with simple indifference. She was just another weak Omega being transferred from one household to another, a transaction as mundane as trading livestock. But when she passed the section where the king sat with his personal guard, she felt something different, something that made her skin prickle with awareness. She didn't dare look directly at him, keeping her eyes fixed on Marcus and the terrible future he represented, but she felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch, heavy and searching and somehow wrong, as if he was seeing something no one else could see. Marcus grabbed her arm when she reached the altar, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. The pack's spiritual leader, Elder Rosewood, began the traditional bonding ceremony, her voice droning through. Ancient words about unity and strength and the sacred duty of Omegas to support their betters. Alara felt disconnected from her own body, floating somewhere above the scene, watching herself being given away like property. This was her life now. This was all her life would ever be. Marcus leaned close, his breath hot and rancid against her ear, and whispered that he was going to enjoy breaking her, that the others had been too easy. But she looked like she might actually put up a fight, and wouldn't that be fun? The words cut through her dissociation like a knife, yanking her back into her body with visceral clarity. She tried to pull away, instinct overriding her learned helplessness, but Marcus's grip tightened viciously, twisting her arm behind her back in a hold that made tears spring to her eyes. She gasped in pain, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet hall, and that was when everything changed. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that frost formed on the Daewoo windows, and a sound like thunder filled the air, except it wasn't thunder. It was a growl so deep and primal that it vibrated in everyone's bones. Alpha King. Kale Stormborn had risen from his seat, his face no longer impassive but transformed into something absolutely feral, his eyes blazing with silver fire that seemed to illuminate the entire hall. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried with such command that even the wind outside seemed to stop. He said one word, just one, but it was imbued with so much power that Marcus released Alara immediately and dropped to his knees, his body forced into submission by the sheer dominance radiating from the king. That word was mine, and it reverberated through Alara's entire being like a bell being struck, awakening something inside her that had been sleeping, something vast and powerful that recognized the truth in his claim, even as her conscious mind reeled in confusion. Kale moved with inhuman speed, crossing the distance, between them in less than a heartbeat, and suddenly he was between her and Marcus, his broad shoulders blocking her view of everything else, creating a barrier that felt impenetrable. The hall erupted into chaos. Alpha Gerald was shouting, demanding to know what the king thought he was doing, that this was a sanctioned union, that he had no right to interfere. The other pack representatives were on their feet, some backing away, others pushing forward to see what was happening. Elder Rosewood looked terrified, her ancient hands clutching her ceremonial staff like a lifeline. But Kyle ignored them all, his attention focused entirely on Alara, and when he turned to look at her, she saw something in his eyes that contradicted every story ever told about him. It wasn't coldness or cruelty, it was recognition. And beneath that, something that looked almost like relief, as if he had been searching for something precious he thought lost forever, and had finally found it. He spoke to her, directly, his voice gentler now, but still carrying that undercurrent of absolute authority that made disobedience physically impossible. He told her she was safe, that no one would touch her again, and then he did something that shocked everyone in the hall into utter silence. He went down on one knee before her, this king who supposedly bowed to no one, and said the words that would change everything. He said she was his fated mate, his true queen, and that the bond between them had always existed, dormant, but unbreakable, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. He said he recognized her the moment she entered the hall, that her scent called to something fundamental in his soul, and that he would burn down kingdoms before he let anyone take her from him. Alara couldn't process what was happening. It was too much, too fast, too impossible. She was nobody, nothing, a defective Omega who couldn't even shift properly. How could she possibly be the fated mate of the most powerful Alpha in the kingdom? But even as her mind rejected the possibility, her body knew the truth. She felt the bond snap into place between them like a golden thread being woven through her chest, warm and vital and absolutely certain. It felt like coming home after being lost her entire life, like finding the missing piece of herself she didn't know was absent. Her wolf, that fragment of herself that had never fully emerged, suddenly surged forward with a strength that made her gasp, responding to his presence with joy and recognition. Alpha Gerald recovered his voice, sputtering protests about pack law and arranged marriages and political agreements. Marcus was still on his knees, but his eyes burned with hatred, his carefully constructed mask of respectability cracking to reveal the monster beneath. Kyle rose to his full height, pulling Alara gently behind him with a protectiveness that felt instinctive rather than performed. When he addressed the assembly, his voice carried the weight of ultimate authority, the voice of a king who had never been challenged because everyone knew the consequences of challenging him. He declared the marriage ceremony null and void, that no power in the kingdom could force a fated mate bond to be ignored, and that anyone who attempted to interfere with his claim would be considered an enemy of the crown and dealt with accordingly. If you're enjoying this story of an Omega discovering her true power and destiny, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think of Kale's dramatic intervention. Should Alara trust him immediately, or should she be cautious? Subscribe to hear more stories about fated mates and the alphas who would destroy worlds to protect them. But Cale wasn't finished. He turned to Marcus, and the look on his face made several people in the audience step back instinctively. He asked Marcus a simple question, asking how many Omegas he had killed, not how many he had hurt or abused, but how many he had actually killed. Marcus tried to deny it, tried to claim he didn't know what the king was talking about. But Cale's eyes flashed silver again, and power rolled off him in waves that made even the strongest alphas in the room bare their throats in submission. He told Marcus not to lie to him, that he had been investigating reports of missing Omegas from the Silvermoon Pack for over a year, that his spies had uncovered evidence of a trafficking ring operating under the protection of certain pack officials, and that Marcus was at the center of it all. The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Ilara felt her knees buckle, and would have fallen if Cale hadn't caught her, his arm around her waist steady and warm. He continued speaking, laying out the evidence his investigation had uncovered with brutal efficiency. Marcus had been taking Omegas as wives, abusing them until they were broken beyond repair, then selling them to rogue packs in the Owen, lawless territories beyond the kingdom's borders, where they disappeared into slavery or worse. The 3 previous wives everyone assumed had simply left were actually dead, their bodies buried in the forest behind Marcus's estate, and he hadn't been working alone. Alpha Gerald had been complicit, taking payment for looking the other way, for helping to falsify records and silence anyone who asked too many questions. Gerald's face went white, then red with rage. He tried to deny everything, calling it slander and political manipulation. But Cale's guards were already moving forward, silver chains in their hands that would suppress even an alpha's strength. Other members of Silvermoon's council were also being detained, faces Ilara recognized, people she had thought were pillars of the community, revealed as corrupt parasites who had profited from the suffering of the most vulnerable. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. It wasn't just about trafficking Omegas. It was about maintaining a system where Omegas had no power, no voice, no protection, so they could be exploited without consequence. And Ilara had nearly become just another victim, another name on a list of the disappeared. Cale kept her close as his guards worked, his presence a solid anchor in the chaos swirling around them. He explained to her quietly, his voice pitched only for her ears, that he had suspected something was wrong in Silvermoon for a long time, but had needed proof before he could act. He told her his attendance at the wedding had not been coincidental, that he had been planning to raid Marcus's estate immediately after the ceremony to gather evidence, but the moment he saw her, the moment he scented his mate about to be handed over to a monster, all his carefully laid plans became irrelevant. He couldn't let it happen. He couldn't stand by and watch her be destroyed. Not when every instinct in his body screamed that she was his to protect, his to cherish, his to keep safe from all harm. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in the bond thrumming between them with increasing intensity. But she had learned through bitter experience that trusting alphas led only to pain. She asked him about the rumors, about his supposed dead mate, about his reputation for cruelty and heartlessness. Cale's expression darkened, but not with anger at her questioning. He told her the truth was complicated, that the rumors had been deliberately cultivated, and that he would explain everything once they were somewhere safe and private. He said she had every right to her doubts and fears, that he wouldn't expect her trust simply because of the mate bond, that he would earn it through his actions over time. The fact that he acknowledged her right to skepticism, that he didn't demand immediate acceptance, meant more to Ilara than any pretty words could have. The king's guards finished securing the prisoners, and Cale addressed the remaining assembly with cold precision. He announced that the Silvermoon Pack would be temporarily placed under direct crown supervision while a full investigation was conducted, that anyone found to be involved in the trafficking operation would face the full consequences of royal law, and that reforms would be implemented immediately to prevent such corruption from taking root again. He also made it clear that Ilara was under his personal protection, that she would be leaving with him immediately, and that any attempt to contact her or interfere with her in any way would be treated as an act of treason. His message was unmistakable and absolute. There would be consequences for what had happened here, consequences that would reshape the power structures of the entire kingdom. As Cale led her out of the hall, Alara caught glimpses of faces in the crowd. Some looked relieved, others frightened, many confused. She saw Mira, another Omega from her pack who had always been kind to her, and the girl mouthed, "Thank you," with tears streaming down her face. How many others had been suffering in silence, trapped in the same system that had nearly destroyed Alara? How many were only now realizing they might actually have a chance at freedom? The weight of it was overwhelming. The knowledge that her near destruction had somehow become the catalyst for exposing something much larger and more terrible than she had ever imagined. The journey to the king's fortress took 3 days, traveling in a heavily guarded convoy through territories Alara had never seen before. Kyle rode beside her carriage, his massive black wolf keeping pace effortlessly, his presence both comforting and intimidating. The other guards treated her with a respect that felt alien and uncomfortable. They called her my lady and bowed when she passed, and asked if she needed anything with genuine concern in their voices. It was such a stark contrast to how she had been treated her entire life that she kept expecting the facade to drop, kept waiting for the cruelty she knew was coming, but it never did. They were simply kind, as if kindness toward an Omega was the most natural thing in the world, as if her comfort and well-being actually mattered. At night, when they camped, Kale shifted back to human form and sat with her by the fire, talking to her about inconsequential things, as if trying to help her feel normal and safe. He told her about the fortress, about the mountains and forests surrounding it, about the library that held thousands of books she would have access to if she wanted. He asked her about her interests, her dreams, the things she had wanted to do before those dreams had been crushed under the weight of her circumstances. She found herself talking more than she had in years, telling him about her love of healing herbs, how she used to sneak into the pack's medical supplies to study the different plants and their properties, how she had once dreamed of becoming a healer before Gerald told her that defective Omegas didn't deserve to have ambitions. Kale listened to everything she said with an intensity that made her feel truly seen for the first time in her life. He told her she would have the opportunity to study healing if she wanted, that the fortress had extensive gardens and a team of healers who would be honored to teach her. He also told her, his voice careful and gentle, that he had noticed something about her wolf, about the way it flickered and struggled to emerge. He said it reminded him of descriptions he had read in ancient texts about a bloodline called the Silver Moons, Omegas with extraordinary power, whose abilities were often suppressed or hidden because other wolves feared them. He suggested that what she thought was weakness might actually be strength being artificially contained, that her difficulty shifting might not be a defect, but a symptom of something else, something that had been done to her. The possibility shook Alara to her core. What if she wasn't broken? What if everything she had been told about herself was a lie designed to keep her powerless? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Kyle must have seen the turmoil in her expression, because he reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and took her hand in his. The contact sent sparks of electricity racing up her arm, the mate bond singing between them with approval. He promised her that they would figure it out together, that he had resources and knowledge that could help her discover the truth about herself, but that there was no pressure, no timeline. She could take as long as she needed to feel safe, to heal from what had been done to her, to decide what she wanted her future to look like. When they finally arrived at the fortress, Alara was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it. Massive stone walls rose from the mountainside like natural extensions of the rock itself, towers reaching toward the sky with windows that caught the sunlight and turned it into blazing gold. The gates opened to reveal a complex of buildings that seemed more like a small city than a single stronghold, with training grounds and gardens and structures whose purposes she couldn't even guess at. But what struck her most was the diversity of wolves she saw. There were alphas and betas as expected, but there were also omegas moving freely, working in positions of clear responsibility and authority, speaking to higher-ranked wolves without fear or submission. One omega woman was clearly leading a training session for younger wolves, her commands sharp and respected. Another was consulting with what looked like military advisors, pointing at maps and contributing to strategic discussions. Kale noticed her stunned expression and explained that his fortress operated differently than most packs. He believed that rank was about aptitude and skill, not designation, and that the old hierarchies that relegated Omegas to servitude and submission were not only unjust, but strategically foolish. Some of his best strategists, his most skilled healers, his most innovative engineers were Omegas, whose talents would have been wasted in traditional pack structures. He had built his power base by recognizing talent wherever it existed and elevating those who deserved elevation regardless of their secondary gender. It was one of the reasons traditional packs viewed him with such suspicion and why rumors about his supposed cruelty had spread so easily. Alphas who benefited from the old system wanted to paint him as a tyrant because his very existence threatened their comfortable positions of unearned privilege. He led her to a suite of rooms in the private section of the fortress, explaining that these would be hers for as long as she wanted them, that she was free to decorate them however she wished, to come and go as she pleased within the fortress grounds, and that guards would be posted outside only to ensure her safety, not to keep her imprisoned. The rooms were beautiful, filled with natural light, and furnished with a comfort that spoke of wealth without ostentation. There was a bedroom with a massive bed covered in soft furs, a sitting room with a fireplace and comfortable chairs, and a bathing room with a tub large enough to swim in. Cale showed her how everything worked, his manner patient and practical. And then he did something that surprised her more than anything else that had happened. He handed her a key and told her the door, locked from the inside, that she controlled access to her own space, that not even he would enter without her explicit permission. The significance of that gesture, of giving her autonomy over her own body and space, made tears well in her eyes. Cale looked stricken, immediately asking if he had done something wrong, if she was frightened, if she needed him to leave. She shook her head, trying to find words to explain that these were not tears of fear, but tears of relief, of gratitude for being treated like a person with rights instead of property to be managed. He seemed to understand without her having to fully articulate it. He told her gently that he knew she had been through trauma, that he didn't expect her to simply accept their bond and move forward as if nothing had happened, that healing took time and patience and safety. He said he would prove to her every single day that she was valued, respected, and protected, and that if she decided ultimately that she didn't want the mate bond, if she wanted to reject him and build a life somewhere else, he would accept that decision and ensure she had the resources to do whatever she chose. The fact that he was offering her the choice to reject him, acknowledging that the mate bond didn't obligate her to anything she didn't freely choose, removed the last of the walls she had instinctively raised against him. She told him she wanted to try, that she was terrified and confused and didn't really understand what was happening, but that she felt the bond between them and wanted to see where it led. The smile that broke across his face transformed him completely, making him look younger and almost vulnerable, nothing like the cold king from the rumors. He thanked her for giving him a chance, promised again that he would earn her trust, and then reluctantly left her to rest, reminding her that she could call for anything she needed at any time. Alone in her rooms, Alara finally allowed herself to process everything that had happened. Just days ago, she had been resigned to a fate of abuse and probable death. Now she was in a fortress in the mountains, claimed by the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, surrounded by Omegas who moved with confidence and purpose, being told she might actually be powerful in ways she had never imagined. It felt like a dream, and she kept expecting to wake up back in Gerald's house with Marcus's cold eyes watching her. But the mate bond humming in her chest was real, as was the key, clutched in her hand, as was the view from her window of mountains painted gold by the setting sun. This was real. She was safe, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the stirring of something that might eventually become hope. The next morning, Cale introduced her to Thalia, an Omega who served as the fortress's head healer and who had agreed to help Alara explore what might be blocking her wolf. Thalia was warm and motherly, with silver streaked through her dark gown, hair and eyes that crinkled with genuine kindness when she smiled. She examined Alara carefully, not just physically, but energetically, her hands hovering over Alara's body, while she muttered to herself in a language Alara didn't recognize. After nearly an hour, Thalia sat back with an expression of carefully controlled fury. She told Alara that her suspicions had been correct, that there were traces of a suppressant in Alara's system, something that had been administered regularly over many years, probably since childhood, designed specifically to prevent her wolf from fully emerging. The revelation was both validating and horrifying. Someone had been poisoning her, deliberately keeping her weak and broken, so she would remain controllable. Thalia explained that the suppressant was an ancient formula, nearly forgotten, that specifically targeted the Silver Moon bloodline, because those Omegas, when fully realized, possessed abilities that could challenge even the most powerful Alphas. They could heal grievous injuries, could sense emotions and intentions with perfect clarity, could rally and protect entire communities with shields of pure energy. They were leaders and protectors and warriors, everything that traditional pack hierarchies insisted Omegas could never be. By keeping Alara suppressed, by convincing her she was defective, whoever had poisoned her had not only stolen her potential, but had ensured she would never threaten the existing power structure. Alara asked who could have done this, who would have known what she was, and how to suppress it. Thalia exchanged a meaningful look with Kyle, who had been present for the examination, standing in the corner with his arms crossed and murder in his eyes. He told Alara that he had suspected from the beginning that Gerald's involvement in the trafficking ring went deeper than simple greed. His investigators had found records in Gerald's house, showing that he had been in contact with a group called the Old Order, a secret society of traditionalist alphas who believed that the hierarchy of alpha over beta over omega was sacred and divinely ordained, and that anyone who threatened that order needed to be eliminated. When Alara's parents died, Gerald had been assigned as her guardian, not randomly but specifically because the Old Order had identified her bloodline and needed someone to keep her contained. The knowledge that Gerald had been systematically destroying her since childhood, that her entire life had been a prison constructed specifically to break her, sent Alara into a spiral of rage and grief that manifested physically as energy crackling around her hands like silver lightning. Thalia immediately coached her through breathing exercises, helping her ground and contain the power that was finally beginning to wake after years of forced dormancy. She explained that Alara's emotions would trigger her abilities at first, before she learned to control them, and that the process of purging the suppressant from her system would take weeks and would not be pleasant. There would be pain, as her wolf finally emerged properly, as her body adjusted to accessing power it had been denied for so long. But Thalia would be with her every step of the way, and so would Kyle if Alara wanted him there. Alara did want him there, despite her lingering wariness, despite all her learned instincts that told her not to depend on anyone. She found herself drawn to Kale's steady presence. He attended every session with Thalia, holding Alara's hand when the pain got bad, talking her through panic attacks when the changes in her body became overwhelming, celebrating quietly when she achieved small victories like maintaining her wolf eyes for more than a few seconds, or channeling her energy into creating a small shield of protective light. He never made her feel weak for struggling, never showed impatience with her progress, never treated her emerging power as something that diminished him. Instead, he seemed genuinely proud of her, genuinely in awe of what she was becoming. Between healing sessions, Kyle began teaching her about the kingdom and the politics that governed it. He explained that his reputation as a heartless tyrant had been carefully constructed after he took the throne 5 years ago, following his father's death. The previous king had been weak, allowing corruption to flourish throughout the territories, and when Kyle inherited the crown, he found himself surrounded by advisors and allies who were secretly working to undermine royal authority in favor of pack autonomy that really meant freedom to abuse and exploit without oversight. The supposed mate whose death everyone whispered about had actually been an assassin sent by the Old Order to kill him, someone who had successfully fooled the mate bond testing rituals with dark magic. He had discovered her true nature just before she attempted to poison him, and instead of executing her publicly and revealing how deeply compromised his court was, he had faked her death and sent her into exile, using the scandal to purge his inner circle of traitors, while building a reputation that made future assassination attempts less likely because everyone believed he was too dangerous to approach. Everything about him, From his cold demeanor, to his intimidating presence, to his reputation for swift, brutal justice, had been armor constructed to protect himself and the kingdom while he worked to root out the corruption that had infected every level of government. The reforms he wanted to implement, the protections for Omegas, and the redistribution of power away from hereditary alpha privilege would have been impossible if he had been seen as weak or sentimental. So he became the monster everyone expected, the tyrant who could not be swayed by emotion or manipulation, all while secretly building networks of resistance and gathering evidence against the very people who thought they controlled him. Meeting Alara had complicated everything, because the mate bond was real and undeniable, and maintaining his cold facade became exponentially harder when every instinct screamed at him to protect her and keep her close. Understanding the truth about him, about the impossible position he had been in, and the sacrifices he had made to protect his people, made Alara see Kale in an entirely new light. He wasn't the heartless king from the rumors. He was someone who had taken on a terrible burden, who had isolated himself and accepted being hated because it was necessary to achieve the greater good. She asked him what would happen now that their bond was public knowledge, now that everyone knew he had a real mate who represented everything the old order feared. Kyle admitted that the danger to both of them had increased exponentially, that the old order would see her as a symbol of everything they were fighting against and would stop at nothing to eliminate her, but that he had been preparing for this fight for years and finally had the alliance and resources to win. What do you think Alara's fully awakened powers will be like? And can Kale and Alara really reform an entire kingdom's worth of corrupt systems? Drop your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about mates who changed the world together. Over the following weeks, as Alara grew stronger and her powers began to stabilize, Kale began introducing her to his inner circle, the people he actually trusted. There was Captain Lyra, a beta woman who commanded the royal guard with tactical brilliance and unwavering loyalty. There was Scholar Finn, an Omega male whose research into ancient wolf history had provided much of the evidence about Alara's bloodline and the suppressants used against her. There was Ambassador Rin, an alpha who had been working undercover within the Old Order for 3 years, gathering intelligence about their plans and membership. Each of them welcomed Alara not just as their king's mate, but as a valuable addition to their cause, someone whose perspective and emerging abilities would strengthen their fight against the entrenched corruption they were working to dismantle. Alara learned that Kale's plans went far beyond simply arresting corrupt officials. He wanted to fundamentally restructure how the kingdom operated, implementing councils with representatives from all designations, creating legal protections that couldn't be overridden by pack alphas, establishing educational systems that would teach young wolves about equality and consent instead of hierarchy and domination. It was revolutionary and terrifying, and exactly what the kingdom needed. But it would also make enemies of everyone who benefited from the current system, and there were many such beneficiaries in positions of significant power. The fight ahead would be dangerous, possibly deadly, and Kale made it clear to Alara that she could choose not to be part of it, that he would keep her safe regardless of whether she wanted to participate in the larger political struggle. But Alara had spent her entire life being powerless, being acted upon instead of acting, and now that she finally had agency and ability, the thought of hiding while others fought for the changes that could have prevented her suffering felt impossible. She told Kale she wanted to help, wanted to be part of the resistance, wanted to use her emerging abilities to protect others, the way she had never been protected. He looked at her with such pride and love that it made her chest ache, and he told her that together they would reshape the kingdom into something better, something worthy of the wolves who would come after them. The commitment wasn't just romantic, it was revolutionary, a partnership built on shared values and mutual respect that went far beyond the mate bond. Her training intensified as her abilities continued to emerge. Thalia taught her how to sense the emotional states of those around her, how to identify deception and ill intent, how to project calm or confidence to influence the feelings of others. She learned to create shields of energy that could protect not just herself, but multiple people simultaneously, barriers strong enough to deflect physical attacks and magical assaults. She discovered she could accelerate healing in others, mending wounds and purging toxins with focused intention. Most surprisingly, she found she could disrupt other wolves' abilities to shift or access their power, temporarily neutralizing threats without causing permanent harm. Every new skill was a revelation, proof that she had never been weak or broken, that she had been powerful all along, but imprisoned by those who feared what she represented. 4 months after the interrupted wedding, Kale decided it was time to move against the old order directly. Rin's intelligence had identified the leadership and their locations, and simultaneous raids were planned across multiple territories. But Kyle also wanted to make a public statement, to show the kingdom that things were changing and that Omegas would no longer be invisible victims. He proposed a formal mating ceremony between himself and Alara, not hidden away in the fortress, but held in the capital city where every pack could send representatives, where the bond between them could be recognized publicly, and her status as queen could be established beyond dispute. It would be dangerous, painting an enormous target on both their backs, but it would also be a declaration that the old ways were ending. Alara agreed, understanding the strategic importance even as the idea terrified her. The ceremony was planned for the new moon, traditionally a time of endings and beginnings, and invitations were sent to every pack in the kingdom, with the implicit message that attendance was not optional. The old order would have to either show themselves by attempting to disrupt the ceremony, or reveal their identities by their notable absence. It was a trap, as much as a celebration, designed to force their enemies into the open where they could be dealt with decisively. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, Alara trained harder than ever, knowing that she would likely need every skill she had learned when the old order made their move. The capital city of Lunaris was transformed for the occasion, banners in silver and midnight blue hanging from every building, the streets cleaned, and decorated with flowers that bloomed even in the autumn chill. Wolves from across the kingdom poured into the city, some out of genuine excitement at seeing their reclusive king finally take a mate, others out of curiosity about the Omega who had supposedly captured his cold heart, still others with darker purposes hidden behind false smiles. Kale's security forces worked overtime to screen everyone entering the city, but they all knew that the old order had resources and connections that might allow them to slip through even the most careful vetting. The ceremony itself was held in the ancient amphitheater at the heart of Lunaris, a massive circular structure that could hold thousands of wolves, and that had been the site of royal bondings for centuries. Ilara wore a dress of silver that seemed to capture and reflect light with every movement, her hair adorned with crystals that Thalia had enchanted with protective charms. She looked nothing like the frightened, broken Omega from the Silver Moon Hall. She looked powerful and regal, every inch a queen, and when she walked down the aisle with her hand in Kale's, she could feel the shock rippling through the audience as they reassessed everything they thought they knew about Omegas and power and destiny. The ceremony proceeded smoothly through the traditional vows and blessings, but Alara could feel the tension building, could sense through her empathic abilities that there were pockets of hostility and malice scattered throughout the audience. She caught Kale's eye and saw that he felt it too, both of them preparing for the attack they knew was coming. It happened during the final bonding ritual, when they were supposed to exchange blood and seal their mate bond permanently before witnesses. A group of 20 wolves suddenly shifted simultaneously, their movements coordinated and purposeful as they charged toward the altar from multiple directions, clearly intending to kill both Alara and Kale before the bond could be completed. But Kyle's forces had been ready, and the moment the attackers revealed themselves, guards moved to intercept, while Alara threw up shields around herself and Kale that turned aside claws and teeth with bursts of silver light. The amphitheater erupted into chaos as more Old Order members revealed themselves, trying to take advantage of the confusion to reach their targets. Alara found herself fighting for her life alongside her mate, using her powers to disable attackers and protect bystanders who were caught in the crossfire, her training coming back to her with crystal clarity. She realized with fierce satisfaction that she wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was defending her kingdom, protecting the future they were trying to build, and she was strong enough to do it. The battle was brief but brutal. Kyle fought with devastating efficiency, his alpha power amplified by rage at those who dared threaten his mate on what should have been their bonding day. Lyra and the royal guard cut through the attackers with practiced precision, capturing rather than killing when possible, because they needed prisoners who could provide information about the rest of the Old Order's network. Ilara's shields protected dozens of innocents from harm, and when one attacker broke through the guard line and lunged at a child who had been separated from her parents in the chaos, Ilara reacted on pure instinct, projecting a blast of energy that sent the attacker flying backward and left him unconscious, but alive. When the fighting finally ended, 15 attackers were in custody, 5 were dead, and not a single innocent bystander had been seriously injured thanks to Ilara's protective abilities. The remaining audience members, those who had not been part of the attack, stared at her with awe and something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. She had proven beyond doubt that Omegas could be powerful, could be warriors and protectors, could stand against threats that would have destroyed others. Kale pulled her close, checking her for injuries with hands that shook slightly with residual adrenaline, and when he found none, he kissed her with a desperation and relief that made her forget anyone was watching. Elder Rosewood, who had been officiating the ceremony and had wisely taken cover when the fighting started, emerged from behind the altar looking shaken, but determined. She declared that no force in existence could prevent the bonding of true mates, and completed the ritual right there in the amphitheater, littered with the evidence of battle, binding Ilara and Kale together with words of power that made the mate bond flare between them like captured lightning. The sensation was overwhelming, a completeness that went beyond physical or emotional into something fundamental and eternal. They were joined, 2 halves of one whole, partners in every sense that mattered. The interrogations of the captured attackers yielded a wealth of information about the Old Order's structure and plans. Over the next months, Kale's forces systematically dismantled the organization, arresting corrupt alphas and betas who had used their positions to abuse and exploit others, seizing assets that had been stolen from vulnerable populations, liberating Omegas who had been trafficked or enslaved. It was difficult and dangerous work, and there were setbacks and losses along the way. But slowly, steadily, the kingdom began to change. New laws were passed protecting Omega rights, establishing penalties for abuse that were actually enforced, creating pathways for Omegas to pursue education and careers that had previously been closed to them. Ilara threw herself into the work of reform with the same intensity she had once brought to simply surviving. She established healing centers where Omegas who had experienced trauma could receive care and support without judgment. She trained other Silver Moon Omegas whose abilities had been suppressed, helping them reclaim their power and teaching them how to use it to protect themselves and their communities. She served on the newly formed Council of All Designations, lending her voice and perspective to policy decisions, and refusing to be silenced or dismissed even by alphas who resented her presence. She became a symbol of what Omegas could be when given the chance, proof that designation did not determine worth or ability. Kyle supported her in everything, never trying to limit her or keep her safe by restricting her activities, understanding that she needed to be part of the change as much as he did. Their relationship deepened beyond the mate bond into genuine partnership, built on trust and shared purpose, and the kind of love that made them both better than they had been alone. They learned each other's wounds and weaknesses, supported each other through doubt and frustration, celebrated victories together, and faced setbacks as a united front. Kale showed Ilara that not all alphas were threats. That power could be used to protect and uplift, rather than dominate and destroy. Ilara showed Kyle that vulnerability was not weakness, that letting someone past his carefully constructed walls enriched rather than endangered him. 3 years after the interrupted wedding that had changed everything, Ilara stood in the same amphitheater where they had bonded, but this time she wasn't there as a bride. She was there as queen, addressing representatives from every pack. In the kingdom at the first annual Council of Wolves, a gathering designed to ensure all voices were heard in governance. She looked out at the diverse crowd, seeing Omegas sitting in positions of authority, seeing young wolves who had grown up under the new laws, and couldn't imagine the old hierarchies, seeing the beginning of the kingdom she and Kale had dreamed of building. There was still work to do, still resistance to overcome, still people who clung to the old ways and resented the changes, but progress was undeniable. She spoke about the journey that had brought them here, about the systems that had almost destroyed her, and the countless others like her, about the courage it took to imagine something different, and the hard work required to make that vision real. She talked about accountability and healing, about the difference between punishment and justice, about building a kingdom where every wolf could thrive regardless of designation or bloodline. Her words were met with thunderous approval from some quarters and stony silence from others. But she no longer needed universal approval to know her worth. She had found her power, her purpose, her voice, and no one could take those things from her again. After the council session ended, Cale found her in the gardens behind the amphitheater, looking out at the city spread below them with the mountains rising in the distance. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder in a gesture of casual intimacy that still made her heart skip. He told her he was proud of her, that she had exceeded every hope he had for what they could accomplish together, that she had become the queen the kingdom needed. She leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the steady pulse of their mate bond, and told him that none of it would have been possible without him stopping that ceremony 3 years ago, without him seeing her when no one else had, without him believing. She was worth saving. He turned her in his arms so they were face to face, his expression serious and tender. He said she had saved herself, that he had simply given her the opportunity to do what she was always capable of, that her strength had been there all along, waiting to be unleashed. He also admitted that stopping the ceremony had been instinct more than strategy, that seeing her in pain had driven him to act without thinking, and that he would do it again 1,000 times because a world without her in it was unthinkable. The confession was raw and honest, stripping away the regal composure he showed the world to reveal the man beneath, the one who had been just as lost as she was until they found each other. Their life together wasn't always easy. There were arguments and disagreements, moments of frustration when their different perspectives on how to handle challenges clashed, times when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. But they had learned to fight fair, to listen, even when they didn't want to hear, to apologize when they were wrong, and to forgive when the other stumbled. They had built a relationship based on equality and respect, where neither dominated the other, but both contributed their strengths to create something stronger than either could be alone. It was the kind of partnership that modeled the kingdom they were building, proof that power shared was power multiplied. Elara often thought about the girl she had been, standing in the Silver Moon Hall in a dress that didn't fit, preparing to marry a monster because she believed she had no other options. That girl had been convinced she was broken, worthless, defective. She had been taught to make herself small, to accept whatever scraps of kindness were thrown her way, to be grateful for any life that didn't involve outright violence. But that girl had also possessed a core of resilience that refused to break no matter how much pressure was applied, a spark of defiance that had survived years of systematic suppression. That spark had been enough, and when given the chance, it had grown into a fire that illuminated the darkness and showed others the way forward. She wasn't that frightened Omega anymore, but she never forgot her, never lost touch with the fear and helplessness that had defined her early life. It was what drove her to fight so hard for others, still trapped in similar circumstances. What gave her empathy for those struggling to believe in their own worth. What made her patient with the slow, difficult work of changing hearts and minds. She carried her past with her not as a burden, but as a reminder of why the work mattered, of what was at stake when they talked about reform and justice and equality. Every Omega she helped, every law they passed, every young wolf who grew up believing their designation didn't limit their potential, was a vindication of the girl she had been, and a promise to the woman she had become. Cale understood this about her, understood that her compassion was born from suffering, and that her determination was fueled by memory. He never tried to get her to let go of her past or move on from her trauma, recognizing that healing didn't mean forgetting, and that her history was part of what made her such an effective advocate. He supported her work even when it made his job harder. even when powerful alphas complained that she was pushing too hard too fast, even when it would have been politically expedient to slow down the reforms. He had promised to earn her trust through his actions, and he kept that promise every day by standing beside her and defending her right to use her voice and power however she saw fit. The kingdom transformed slowly, but surely under their joint leadership. The healing centers Alara established became models for trauma-informed care that were replicated across territories. The educational reforms they implemented began producing generations of young wolves who questioned the old hierarchies and demanded better from their leaders. The legal protections for Omegas drastically reduced instances of abuse and trafficking, and when violations did occur, they were investigated and prosecuted with the full force of royal authority. It wasn't perfect, and there were still those who clung to traditional ways and resented the changes. But the direction was unmistakable, and the momentum was building. 5 years after their dramatic bonding, Alara gave birth to twin daughters who entered the world screaming defiance and radiating power that made the healers attending the birth gasp in awe. The girls were Silver Moon Omegas like their mother, their abilities apparent from birth in a way that would have terrified wolves committed to the old hierarchies but filled Alara with joy and pride. She looked at these fierce, tiny beings and knew they would never experience what she had endured, would never be taught to doubt their worth or suppress their power, would grow up in a kingdom that valued them for exactly who they were. That knowledge made every sacrifice, every battle, every difficult day worth it. Kale was a devoted father, participating fully in caring for the twins, despite the raised eyebrows from traditional wolves who thought alpha kings should remain distant from such domestic concerns. He changed diapers and walked the floor with crying infants and sang lullabies in a surprisingly gentle voice, utterly unconcerned with maintaining the cold, fearsome image that had once been necessary. The twins adored him, reaching for him with chubby hands and giggling at his silly faces, seeing him not as a king or an alpha, but simply as their father who loved them unconditionally. Watching him with their daughters, Alara fell in love with him all over again, amazed by his capacity for tenderness and his complete lack of ego when it came to his family. They raised the twins to understand their privilege and responsibility, teaching them about the kingdom's history and the work that had been done to create a better present. The girls grew up playing with children from all designations, learning that everyone had value regardless of rank or bloodline, developing empathy and awareness that would serve them well, whether they eventually took on leadership roles or chose different paths. Alara and Kale were determined that their children would not repeat the mistakes of previous generations, that the cycle of domination and submission would end with them. On the 10th anniversary of the day Kale had stopped Alara's wedding to Marcus, they returned to Silver Moon territory for the first time since the arrests and investigations that had exposed the trafficking ring. The pack had been thoroughly reformed under new leadership, with Omegas serving on the council and in positions of authority throughout the community. The healing center Alara had established there was thriving, helping survivors rebuild their lives and reclaim their power. She visited the center and spoke with the Omegas receiving care, sharing her own story and offering hope that healing was possible, that they could move beyond what had been done to them. Mira was there, the Omega who had mouthed thank you in the chaos of that day 10 years ago. She had become a counselor at the center, using her own experiences to help others navigate their trauma. She hugged Alara tightly and told her that stopping her wedding had saved not just Alara's life, but countless others, that the exposure of the trafficking ring had broken open a system of abuse that had destroyed generations of Omegas. Mira had been next on Marcus's list, had been scheduled to become his 5th wife in a ceremony that would have taken place just months after Alara's. By interrupting one wedding, Kale had prevented not just that specific horror, but the many that would have followed. The full scope of what they had accomplished hit Alara in that moment. It wasn't just about her, personal healing, or even the reforms they had implemented at the kingdom level. It was about all the individual lives that had been saved, all the futures that had been reclaimed, all the young Omegas who would grow up believing they were valuable and powerful because the systems that would have taught them otherwise no longer existed. The work was far from complete. There were still territories where old attitudes persisted, and still wolves who needed help. But the trajectory was undeniable. They had changed the world, not through dramatic gestures, but through sustained, committed action over years and years. Standing in the Silver Moon Healing Center with Mira and the other survivors, Ilara thought about how different things might have been if Kale hadn't been at that ceremony, if he hadn't recognized their mate bond, if he hadn't had the power and will to intervene. She might have become another name on the list of the disappeared, another victim whose suffering was hidden and ignored. But she also realized that even without Kale, something in her would have survived. That spark that had refused to be extinguished would have found another way to manifest. Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe the path would have been harder. But she liked to think that eventually she would have found her power and her purpose, even without the mate bond that had accelerated everything. That night, lying in bed with Kale's arms around her, and their daughters sleeping peacefully in the next room, Ilara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a frightened, broken Omega who thought she was worthless to a queen who had helped reshape an entire kingdom. From someone who could barely shift to a Silver Moon Omega with abilities that continued to grow and develop. From a victim of systematic abuse to a survivor who used her experience to help others, she had been transformed. But more than that, she had transformed others, had been part of a movement that elevated and empowered the most vulnerable wolves in their society. Kale stirred beside her, some instinct always attuned to her emotional state, even when he was asleep. He pulled her closer and murmured against her hair, asking if she was all right, if she needed anything. She smiled in the darkness and told him she was exactly where she needed to be, that she had everything she needed right here. He kissed her temple and settled back into sleep, his presence a constant source of comfort and strength. She had spent so many years believing she would never be safe, never be valued, never be loved, and now she had all of that and more. Not because someone had given it to her, but because she had claimed it for herself with Kyle beside her, as her partner and equal. The kingdom they built together continued to evolve and improve with each passing year. New leaders emerged from the Omega community, taking their places in governance and military and scholarly pursuits. The healing centers expanded their reach, developing new therapies and approaches to trauma recovery. The educational system they had reformed produced wolves who questioned injustice and demanded accountability from those in power. The legal protections they had fought for were strengthened and expanded, closing loopholes and addressing new challenges as they emerged. It was never finished. The work of building a just society never was, but they had created structures and institutions that would outlast them, that would continue, pushing toward equality and dignity for all wolves long after they were gone. Ilara became known throughout the kingdom, not just as the queen, but as the Silver Moon, the Omega who had reclaimed her power and used it to lift others. Stories were told about her in every territory, about the girl who was meant to be sacrificed but became a savior instead, about the Luna who could heal wounds and shield the vulnerable and stand against the most powerful alphas without flinching. Young Omegas looked to her as proof of what they could become, as evidence that their designation did not define their destiny. She carried that responsibility seriously, understanding that she had become a symbol whether she wanted to be or not, and that how she conducted herself mattered to thousands of wolves she would never meet. Kale remained her constant partner in everything, the alpha who had proven that power could be used to protect rather than dominate, that strength could be gentle, that love could be both fierce and tender. He governed with wisdom and justice, maintaining the security and prosperity of the kingdom while pushing constantly for reforms that made it more equitable and inclusive. He was respected and, increasingly, genuinely loved by his people, who had come to understand that his earlier reputation for coldness had been protective coloring rather than his true nature. Together, they modeled a kind of leadership that inspired rather than intimidated, that empowered rather than controlled. Their daughters grew into remarkable young wolves, confident and compassionate, powerful and humble. They understood from an early age that they were privileged, but that privilege came with responsibility, that their abilities should be used to help others rather than elevate themselves. They trained with Thalia and other healers, learning to control and direct their silver moon powers. They studied history and politics and strategy, preparing for whatever futures they chose to build. They were loved fiercely by both parents and by the extended family of advisors and guards and healers who had helped raise them, surrounded by examples of what healthy relationships and equitable partnerships looked like. On the 15th anniversary of the interrupted wedding, the kingdom held a celebration not just of Alara and Kale's bond, but of all the changes that had followed from that pivotal moment. Wolves from every territory gathered in Lunaris to share stories about how their lives had improved under the reforms, how the new laws had protected them or their loved ones, how the healing centers had helped them recover from trauma, how the educational changes had opened opportunities that would have been impossible under the old system. The celebration was joyful and hopeful, a recognition of how far they had come, and a recommitment to the work still ahead. Alara addressed the crowd as she had many times before, but this time her message was about gratitude and collaboration rather than advocacy and reform. She thanked everyone who had worked for change, who had taken risks to challenge injustice, who had supported survivors and pushed for accountability. She acknowledged that the progress they had made was not the work of any one wolf or even any one generation, but the result of countless individuals choosing to do better, to be better, to build better. She reminded them that the fight wasn't over, that there would always be those who preferred the old ways, and that vigilance was necessary to protect the gains they had made. But she also celebrated how much had been accomplished and how many lives had been improved. When she finished speaking, Kale joined her on the platform, and they stood together looking out at their kingdom, their people, their legacy. He took her hand and she squeezed back, the gesture private and intimate despite the thousands of witnesses. They had built something meaningful together, something that would endure beyond them. And the satisfaction of that knowledge was profound. They had taken a moment of potential tragedy, a wedding that should have ended in Alara's destruction, and transformed it into the catalyst for revolutionary change. They had proven that love and justice could coexist, that power could be used for good, that even the most broken wolves could heal and thrive when given the chance. As the celebration continued around them, and their daughters played with other children in the Yamao festival grounds and the sun set over Lunaris, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Alara reflected on the girl she had been 15 years ago, terrified and resigned and convinced of her own worthlessness. If she could go back and speak to that girl, she would tell her to hold on, that rescue was coming, that she was stronger than she knew, that she was worthy of love and safety and dignity. She would tell her that the pain wouldn't last forever, that healing was possible, that she would not just survive but thrive in ways that seemed impossible in that dark moment. But mostly, she would tell her that she deserved better, and that it was okay to want better, to fight for better, to believe that better was possible, because sometimes, just sometimes, the king stops the ceremony and the Omega finds her power, and together they change the world.